Have you ever wondered what happens to the gods when no one calls their names anymore? There was once a king of the sky, a child whose siblings were swallowed by his father, a youth raised between the clouds and a legacy of silence, and a god who sparked the very first fire in the heart of humankind. Zeus was not just thunder, he was memory. He was the first to silently love humanity, and the last to accept being forgotten, so he could become a breeze, a star, a story that never truly ends. This isn't just Greek mythology. It's a journey into memory and forgetting, a tale of the last light of Olympus, and the god who still watches you quietly every time you look up at the sky. There are nights when the air itself feels sacred, when the world seems to hush just enough to listen. Tonight is one of those nights, and if you're here, perhaps your heart has been waiting for this moment without knowing it. So before we begin, take a breath, not a rushed one, not a shallow one, but a full, quiet inhale. And now, let it go, slowly, gently. Imagine your breath is mist, and that mist is being carried away by the wind, drifting into a sky lit by stars as old as time. Now close your eyes. You are no longer lying on a bed of sheets and pillows. Number tonight, your body is resting upon something far more ancient, a cloud bed, light as breath, warm as memory, and spun from the whispers of Olympus itself. It cradles you like a lullaby only the sky remembers. The tension in your chest loosens. Your limbs feel less like bone and more like air. The cloud softens you, unwinds you, opens the door between waking and dreaming. Somewhere far above, where the stars keep their secrets, a god is waiting. His name is Zeus. To some, he is thunder. To others, justice. But long before he ruled Olympus, before he hurled lightning or held court with immortals, Zeus was a boy hidden in the branches of a sacred tree, suspended between earth and sky. But let's not rush. Let's begin where all true stories do, not with power, but with quiet. High atop Mount Olympus, at its highest peak called Stephani, Zeus sits alone. His robes shimmer like springtime clouds rimmed with gold. His beard flows down in soft silver waves, thick and curling like the rivers of time. On his belt, his lightning bolt pulses softly, not with fury, but with presence. A reminder, a heartbeat of divine authority. His eyes, sharper than eagles, look out over the land of mortals and gods. He sees everything, the snow caps of Olympus to the north, the green and gold fields of the Peloponnesus to the south, the sapphire Ionian Sea to his right, the scattered islands of the Aegean to his left, and far, far beyond, Libya, Egypt, the edge of the known world. But today, his gaze drifts inward. It falls upon the island of Crete and lingers. There, long ago, Zeus was born, not into a cradle of comfort, but into fear, a fear wrapped in prophecy and the madness of a father gone wrong. Cronus was not always a tyrant. In the beginning, he was a titan ablaze with potential, but as power calcified around him, so did his paranoia. He ruled with a cold grip and a sharpened sickle, and when a prophecy foretold that his own child would one day overthrow him, he did the unthinkable. He swallowed his children, one by one, Hestia, Hades, Demeter, Poseidon, Hera, each taken at birth, consumed before they could cry. Zeus's mother, Rhea, wept each time, but she dared not rebel, not yet, not until her 6th pregnancy. This time, she had a plan. As the pain of labor began to rise like a tide, Rhea cried out, not in grief, but in performance. She held a swaddled bundle, a stone wrapped in cloth, and when Cronus arrived, he took it without suspicion. He swallowed it whole, convinced he had snuffed out fate once more. But the real child, the boy born to light and thunder, was spirited away. On the lush island of Crete, hidden among trees older than memory, Gaia, the Earth Mother, took the infant Zeus in her arms. She placed him in the care of Amalia, a gentle goat with eyes like polished amber and a spirit pure as the first dawn. They hung his cradle between branches, neither on land nor in sky, where Cronus's gaze could not find him. And there, swaying softly in his leafy hammock, Zeus drank deep from the milk of Amalia and the bounty of Gaia. His laughter echoed like music across the trees. Even then, the wind seemed to bend toward him, listening. Even then, the clouds seemed to drift with purpose. One afternoon, Amalia nudged him playfully, as goats often do. The young god giggled and wrapped his tiny hand around her horn. He tugged, too hard, and with a snap, it broke free. The world paused. But where there should have been pain or panic, something wondrous happened. The horn overflowed with food, ripe fruits, fragrant breads, glowing honeycomb, vegetables still kissed by dew. It poured out abundance, endless and eternal. It was his first gift, the cornucopia, a symbol not of war, but of provision. Zeus did not yet know what he was, but the world did. Back on Mount Olympus, the adult Zeus smiles faintly as he remembers. His fingers trace the air, as if the memory is something he can still touch. The clouds above him swirl gently, responding not to the wind, but to his mood. And you, softly resting on your cloud bed, are being invited to witness what comes next, to feel the fire that once flickered inside a child hiding in the branches, and would one day blaze across the skies. But for now, let your thoughts float. Let the cloud carry you, because soon we'll return to the island of Crete, where prophecy waits and power begins with a whisper. On the northwestern edge of the island of Crete, there is a small cliff that looks out over the Mediterranean Sea. It was there, on a gentle golden afternoon, when the sunlight shimmered like stardust on the water's surface, that two figures stood quietly side by side, a mother and a child destined for godhood. Rhea leaned down, taking her son's small hand. Her fingers were still soft, still full of the warmth that had comforted him through countless silent nights, hiding from the cruelty of her husband. She guided young Zeus to the cliff's edge, where the sea breeze rose like a lullaby, lifting their hair in a wind that felt stitched from threads of heaven and earth. "You always ask," Rhea said softly, "why I can never stay with you long, why I appear and disappear like the tide. Tonight, you deserve the truth." Zeus didn't speak. His eyes, far too serious for a 10-year-old, held something quiet, waiting, something that looked very much like prophecy. Rhea lowered herself to the grass, gently tugging her son to sit beside her. The sea before them stretched endlessly, a blue so deep it could swallow sound. But within Rhea's heart, memories were rising like waves from the deep. She began to speak, slowly, steadily, of love and loss, of the Titan she had once adored, and the darkness that had replaced him. She told of Cronus, once passionate, now consumed by fear. She told of 5 children taken too soon, swallowed in an instant by their father's dread of being overthrown. She told of hope, shredded and sewn back together with trembling hands, hope she had poured into her final child, Zeus. When she reached the part about his siblings, about the silence that followed each birth, Zeus tightened his fist. The sea breeze no longer felt innocent. It carried a heavier scent of salt, and though the sun still hung in the sky, its light dimmed just slightly at the edges. Rhea paused. She looked at him. Zeus gazed forward toward the horizon, and then, after a long silence, he turned to her. In his eyes, the amber of sunset flared like twin sparks. "Mother," he said, "if I was born to stop him, then I will. Not for a throne, but because my brothers and sisters deserve to be free." Rhea didn't weep, but something deep within her shifted, like Olympus itself trembled softly beneath the weight of a boy's first vow. That was the beginning. Zeus began his training, not with swords or shields, but with spirit. Gaia, the great Earth Mother, returned to guide him. So did Metis, the ocean-born goddess of wisdom, whose voice carried the calm of deep waters. They did not teach him to strike. They taught him to observe, to listen, to lead without fear. Metis said, "A ruler who must frighten his people to keep power is already weak." Gaia whispered, "Compassion is not a crack in the armor. It is the ground beneath a kingdom that lasts." Day by day, Zeus studied. Night after night, he looked up at the stars, wondering if any sliver of his father's old goodness still remained. But every time he remembered the children swallowed in darkness, something inside him hardened into resolve. One night, after a long lesson by the stream, Zeus stood beneath the same oak tree where he had once slept as an infant. The branches had thickened. The leaves rustled in the moonlight. He placed his hand on the trunk, on the very bark that had cradled him between heaven and earth, and whispered, not to anyone, but to fate itself, "I will not be just the sixth child. I will be the one who tears open the gates for those swallowed and forgotten." Something heard him. From deep within the roots of the world, something ancient stirred. From the edges of the wind, a whisper answered. And from the crown of Olympus, clouds began to shift, softly, slowly, not with thunder, but with purpose. Not all battles begin with war cries. Some begin in kitchens of earth and water, in pots where herbs whisper old truths. And so, while Zeus trained and the stars silently watched, a new chapter unfolded, not in Olympus, but across the lands of ancient Greece, where a goddess walked unseen, gathering the ingredients of destiny. Her name was Metis. She moved like wind over still water, barefoot through fields, hands brushing past wildflowers, eyes sharp as obsidian. No mortal saw her, and even the birds quieted their songs as she passed. She was the ocean's daughter, wise beyond years, trusted by Gaia and beloved by Rhea. And she had one task, to brew a potion that would awaken a sleeping world by first putting its tyrant to sleep. Metis visited high cliffs where time bloomed in the cracks of stone. She gathered nightshade from under moonlight and poppy petals that shimmered in the morning dew. From sacred groves, she took dried lavender stalks, symbols of calm. From volcanic springs, she drew mineral salts infused with ancient fire. And from the roots of the earth herself, Gaia gifted her with a rare root, white-veined and humming with primordial power. For a month, Metis worked in secret, her small cauldron warmed by the breath of the earth. Every night, she sang into the mixture, not with words, but with vibration. Her voice was low, steady, echoing in rhythms that only the soil remembered. And slowly, as the days passed, the concoction darkened into something viscous and strange, glowing softly like a storm cloud before rain. When the potion was ready, Metis carried it in a stone bowl carved from the cliffs of Naxos. She brought it to Rhea under the cover of starlight, and together they prepared for the most delicate moment of all, facing Cronus. Cronus, the devourer, the Time Lord, the king of unyielding fear, still sat atop Mount Othris, the black mountain to the south. From a distance, he looked like part of the peak itself, immovable, cruel, cut from volcanic stone. His eyes, always watchful, scanned the sky, sea, and land for rebellion. His hands never strayed far from the great curved sickle in his lap, a weapon stained with the fall of Uranus, his own father. But in those eyes, Rhea saw something else: exhaustion. Even gods grow weary when they rule by fear alone. When Rhea arrived, she brought no armies, she brought no threats, she brought only herself, draped in twilight-colored robes, and the bowl. "My lord," she said with a bow, "you haven't slept for many moons. Let me help you." Cronus's voice rumbled like a landslide. "Sleep is for the weak. I have no time for dreams." "But even titans must dream," Rhea replied, "or they forget who they once were." That struck something in him. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time in ages, Cronus's hand relaxed on the sickle. "What have you brought?" he asked. "Only what the earth gave willingly," she said. "It will calm your thoughts, silence the wind within." Cronus took the bowl and drank. The effect was not immediate. Titans do not fall like trees, but slowly, so slowly, it began. His breath deepened, his eyelids drooped, the eternal tension in his shoulders softened, like rock weathered by sea foam. His thoughts, once sharp like blades, dulled into mist. And then, from behind a grove, a rustle. Zeus had arrived. He was grown now, not in body, but in knowing. The forest itself seemed to bow as he stepped into the clearing. Rhea stood silently beside her husband, who now swayed gently in place, lulled by Metis's gift. In that sacred hush, something sacred was released. Cronus's mouth opened, and from within, like stars emerging from darkness, came 5 fully grown beings: Hestia, Hades, Demeter, Poseidon, Hera. They stumbled at first, blinking against the light, touching the earth like children rediscovering the feeling of air on skin. Confused, yes, but alive, whole. Zeus exhaled. His siblings were free. Cronus, overcome by the final waves of the potion, began to collapse. Rhea stepped forward, placing her hand gently on his arm, not out of affection, but out of farewell. Metis had added not only sleep to the drink, but mercy. The Titan would not wake for many years. The gods had escaped, but the war was only beginning. That night, under a sky jeweled with stars, the 6 newly reunited siblings and their mother fled to a hidden sanctuary, back to Crete, where the trees remembered their names. There they sat in a circle, eating simple food, drinking sacred water, and touching hands they hadn't held since birth. Laughter rose, tears flowed. Zeus sat between Poseidon and Hera, watching them joke, watching Hestia hum a forgotten lullaby. He did not yet wear a crown, but something in the way the firelight danced on his face made the others glance toward him more than once. Rhea saw it too, and smiled. The stars had never seen such a gathering. Beneath the sacred canopy of night, deep in the heart of Crete, the newly freed gods sat with their mother, limbs wrapped in warmth and awe. Hestia passed bread to Hades. Hera and Poseidon whispered over a glowing bowl of spring water, studying their reflections as if searching for who they had become. Demeter leaned into the crook of Rhea's arm like a child again. And Zeus watched them all, not as a king, not yet, but as the one who had returned them from silence. And somewhere between the steam of honeyed tea and the flicker of firelight, the weight of that truth settled into his bones. This was not the end. It was the beginning. When dawn broke, it did so in silence. Even the birds withheld their songs. Something had shifted in the world, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Rhea rose first, eyes rimmed with the gentleness of both joy and warning. "You have done what no one thought possible," she told her children, "but now comes the part no one will ever forget." She spoke of the Titans. Cronus would sleep, yes, but not forever, and not alone. The other Titans, Hyperion, Oceanus, Coeus, Creus, Iapetus, and countless others, still ruled the high places of the world. They had built fortresses in the sky, carved palaces into the mountains, and stitched their dominion into the air like invisible chains. They would not give up their thrones. They would not welcome change, and they would not forget Zeus's name. "But we are gods," Hera said, voice firm. "We do not hide. And we are family," Poseidon added. "We rise together, or we fall as one." Zeus listened. The fire crackled. In its glow, he saw not just siblings, but generals, warriors, souls born for a world that no longer wished to sleep beneath a tyrant's shadow. He stood. The sky above trembled, not from thunder, but from decision. "Then let it be known," Zeus declared, "a new age begins today, not through conquest, but through courage, not for power, but for justice." And so the gods left Crete, not as fugitives, but as heirs. They traveled by starlight. Hestia carried the sacred flame. Demeter coaxed the earth to yield food where none had grown. Poseidon called forth fresh water from stone. Hera charted their path, ever precise. Hades kept watch from behind, silent and unblinking. And Zeus, he walked at the center. Each footstep echoed with stormlight, as if the clouds had begun to follow him, whispering, "He has come. He has come." When they reached the base of Mount Olympus, the mountain greeted them, not with silence, but with music. The winds howled not in warning, but in welcome. The snowcaps sparkled with strange anticipation. Here, at last, was the place of their destiny. But the Titans had already stirred. From the far reaches of the sky came Hyperion, god of light, eyes burning like suns. Oceanus rose from the deep, waves roaring behind him. Coeus brought winds that shattered cliffs. Creus hurled comets through the clouds. Iapetus, lord of mortal life and pain, walked with chains in each hand. And last of all came Atlas, towering, terrifying, the one who would bear the heavens if forced, or break them if not. They stood at the borders of Olympus like shadows rebuking dawn. Zeus stepped forward. "There is room in this world for both memory and renewal," he said, "but not for cruelty." Atlas laughed. "You are but a child, a voice with no throne." "I am the echo of every swallowed scream," Zeus replied, "and I do not speak alone." Then Hera stepped beside him. Poseidon unsheathed a trident of sky-blue crystal. Hades raised a hand veiled in smoke. Demeter held vines that pulsed with green fire. Hestia's hearth flared gold in her palms. And above them all, the clouds began to stir. So began the Titanomachy, the war of heaven and earth. It did not last a day. It did not last a year. It lasted 10. Mountains cracked, oceans boiled, forests wept and were born again. Gods and titans clashed not only with weapons, but with will. Some fought with storms, others with shadow. Some titans fell like thunder, others were mourned like old songs, lost forever in the roar. But the young gods were not alone. Allies emerged, those who remembered the kindness of Rhea or feared the madness of Cronus's return. The Hecatonchires with 100 hands of stone, the Cyclopes who forged weapons in the heart of volcanoes, and Prometheus, the titan of forethought who had always believed in what could be rather than what had been. It was he who brought Zeus the final gift, a bolt, not of lightning, but of choice. "Strike," Prometheus whispered, "not to destroy, but to awaken the world." And Zeus did. On the final day, he rose into the sky, called down the storm, and hurled the thunder that cracked the tyranny of time itself. Cronus's reign ended, and a new era began. The storm passed, and in its silence, the world listened. Ash floated like soft snow through the valleys. Rivers, once torn by fury, began to remember their paths. Even the winds, tired from their cries, settled into long, gentle breaths. The war of heaven and earth was over, and yet the heavens themselves had never felt so new. Zeus stood atop the summit of Mount Olympus, the highest place in all the world. His robes, torn from battle, flapped softly in the breeze. His hand, still pulsing with the charge of his final thunderbolt, slowly lowered to his side. It was done. Cronus and the rebelling Titans had been defeated, cast down into the deep chasm of Tartarus, sealed behind gates forged by Cyclops and guarded by the 100-handed Hecatonchires. Justice had been served, but victory was not triumph, not yet. From the mist rose the voices of his siblings. Hera approached first, her golden eyes calm but clear. "We have won," she said, "but what now?" Poseidon stepped forward, his trident humming with ocean breath. "Do we divide the world, or rule it together?" Zeus looked at them. He saw not rivals, but pillars, not threats, but family. The war had not fractured them, it had forged them. "We rise," Zeus said, "not above each other, but as one." So they did. Together, the 6 siblings gathered on Olympus's peak. It was no longer just a mountain. It had become something more, shaped by war, crowned by peace. The air shimmered with divine purpose. Clouds circled in reverence. The very rocks hummed as if remembering their true name. Olympus, their home, their throne. But a throne must be more than stone and sky. It must serve. So they began to build, not with walls, but with order, not with iron, but intention. Zeus declared that he would watch over the sky, the storm, the law of divine justice. Hera, regal and wise, took her place as the queen of the gods, the patroness of union, marriage, and oaths unbroken. Poseidon claimed the seas and their secrets, ensuring balance between calm tides and tempests. Demeter would nourish the land, goddess of harvest, grain, and the sacred cycles of growth. Hades, silent and deep as night, took the underworld, not as punishment, but as guardian of the resting. And Hestia, sweet Hestia, became the flame in every hearth, the keeper of the home, the fire that never leaves. They did not crown themselves with gold. They crowned themselves with purpose, and the world responded. Mountains bent toward Olympus in quiet recognition. The stars realigned, forming new constellations in honor of the gods. The seasons, once formless, began their sacred turning. Spring rose, summer bloomed, autumn whispered, winter slept. Time, once wild and wounded, began to move in rhythm with divine breath. But something was still missing. One night, as silver moonlight spilled over Olympus like melted glass, Zeus sat alone, his feet resting in a spring that bubbled from the mountain's heart. Prometheus approached, his steps soft, his gaze distant. "You are quiet," the Titan said. Zeus nodded. "The world is vast, and yet it feels empty." "Because it is waiting," Prometheus replied. "You see the cracks. I see what could fill them." Zeus turned to him. "Show me." And Prometheus did. They walked together, across meadows untouched by foot, through forests where no beast yet stirred. The land was beautiful, yes, but still wild, still raw. "Life needs mirror," Prometheus said. "Something that can learn, create, question, fail, and rise again." Zeus listened, and a thought, like lightning, struck. "What if we shaped a new being?" he whispered. "Something made not of heaven or underworld, but of clay and dream?" Prometheus smiled. "Then let us make humans. Not as gods, not as animals, but as a bridge between both." They returned to Olympus with the idea glowing between them like a secret flame. The gods gathered. Some were cautious, others curious. Athena, ever wise, stepped forward. "If they are to think," she said, "then let me grant them reason." Hephaestus, the smith god, offered tools. Demeter promised fruit. Poseidon pledged rain. Even Hades, from his shadowed realm, agreed to guard their final rest. And so, under starlight, Prometheus knelt at the riverbank. From clay, he formed the first humans, shaping them tall and varied, with eyes like starlit lakes and hands meant to build. Athena breathed wisdom into their minds. Zeus touched their chests, sparking spirit. Life moved through them. They opened their eyes, and the gods were silent. In those small creatures, so fragile, so wondrous, they saw the beginning of something that even they could not fully grasp. Potential, beauty, chaos, love, a reflection not of perfection, but of possibility. And when the humans smiled, not in fear, but in awe, Olympus smiled back. There are gifts that shine brighter than starlight, and there are rules that weigh heavier than mountains. The gods had created humanity with care, with intention. Each figure shaped from clay, breathed into by divine wisdom, and kissed with spirit by Zeus himself. They laughed, they learned, they stumbled, and rose. They marveled at the sky and sang to the rivers. They built no temples yet, but in the way they danced in the sunlight or held hands at night, it was clear they were grateful for life. Olympus watched in wonder, but Zeus, he watched with caution. One evening, while golden clouds drifted lazily past his throne, he sat in quiet thought, eyes fixed on the world below. Prometheus approached, as he often did, a warm ember in hand and a question in his brow. "You're frowning," the Titan said. Zeus didn't respond at first. His voice, when it came, was soft. "They are curious. They are meant to be," Prometheus replied. "They are clever," Zeus added, "as you wished them to be. But cleverness," Zeus said, "leads to ambition. And ambition, without limits, burns everything it touches." Prometheus tilted his head. "You fear them. I fear what they might become. Too soon." So Zeus made a decree. Of all the gifts bestowed upon mankind, language, harvest, shelter, song, one would remain withheld. One would be sacred, forbidden. Fire. It was not just flame. It was transformation. It cooked food, forged metal, cast shadows, and broke darkness. It was the symbol of will, of knowledge, of danger. "If they learn fire," Zeus said, "they will think themselves gods." Prometheus bowed his head, but he did not agree. That night, he returned to Earth, walking among the humans as they huddled for warmth, rubbing their hands together beneath leaves and branches, whispering to the stars for heat that never came. He saw their breath in the cold, their cracked lips, their shivers, and something broke in him, not out of defiance, but out of love. Prometheus had seen many things in his endless life. He had witnessed wars between titans, the birth of oceans, the rise of sky. But nothing moved him like these fragile creatures, not because they were weak, but because they tried over and over again. So, one night, he climbed Mount Olympus alone. He waited until Helios, the sun god, had parked his chariot and the palace was asleep. He crept into the divine forge, where Hephaestus had stored embers of cosmic fire, flames not of wood, but of stars. And he stole one, small, simple, but eternal. He cupped it in both hands, wrapping it in reeds, and descended back to earth. When the humans awoke the next morning, they found it, flickering, glowing, alive. Prometheus stood beside it, his face warm in the light. "This," he said gently, "is your inheritance." They reached toward it, hesitant, reverent, and when one woman placed her hand near, felt its warmth, and laughed. It was as if the entire earth exhaled. They began to build. Stone gave way to metal. Cold food became feasts. Night lost its fear. Around the fire, stories were born. Around the fire, love became ritual. And from the skies, Zeus saw. Amber lights dotted the land, small but growing. He knew at once what had happened. There was no rage, not at first, only stillness, disappointment. Then came the whisper of wind, the rumble of cloud, and finally, the storm that split the sky in two. Prometheus stood on a hilltop as lightning slashed across the heavens. "You gave them fire," Zeus said, his voice thundering across the valley. "I gave them hope," Prometheus replied. Zeus descended in silence, his robes trailing clouds, his eyes shadowed with sorrow. "You broke the law. I honored their future. They were not ready. They were dying." A long pause. Even the wind stopped. "You defied me," Zeus said. "Yes," Prometheus whispered, "because I believe in them." Zeus raised a hand, not in violence but in decree. The heavens dimmed, Olympus shuddered. "For your defiance," he said, "you will pay a price." Prometheus bowed. "I know." And so he did. Zeus commanded that the Titan be bound, not to Tartarus like the rebels, but to the edge of the mortal world, to a lonely cliff on the far side of the earth, where sky and stone meet the void. There, Prometheus was chained, arms stretched to either side, his body lashed to rock. Every morning, an eagle came. It feasted, and every night the wound healed. Pain returned, again and again, a punishment that had no end. But Prometheus never screamed, because from where he hung, far above the ocean, he could still see them. The humans. They had kindled the flame. They had built homes, forged tools, shared laughter. They had turned darkness into song. And Prometheus smiled. He had given them a beginning. Zeus watched too. From Olympus, he saw the light spreading across the world. He saw the children learning, the families gathering, the dreams being written in firelight. And part of him, deep within the silence of his throne, wondered, had Prometheus been wrong? Or had he simply been first to see? The fires spread. From one village to the next, across plains and rivers, the sacred flame Prometheus had given began to glow in hearths and hearts alike. Humanity, once trembling in the cold, now danced beneath starlight. They forged tools from iron, cooked roots into meals, shaped earth into clay homes. Around each fire, they told stories, not just of gods or titans, but of themselves. They laughed louder, sang longer, loved deeper. And for the first time, They began to choose. Zeus saw it all from his seat atop Olympus. His gaze drifted each evening across the land, watching the flickering lights, tiny beacons of will scattered like constellations on the ground. But what once had felt like a betrayal now felt like something else, a question. The gods did not sleep, but they dreamed, in long moments of silence, in the stillness between lightning strikes. And in those dreams, Zeus walked barefoot among the humans. He felt their joy, their pain, their endless yearning to become more than what they were. It stirred something ancient inside him, not fear, but memory. He remembered a child once hidden in a tree, suspended between heaven and earth. He remembered the ache of not knowing who he was meant to be. And now, looking down upon humankind, he saw echoes of that same ache in every one of them. They were flawed, yes, but they were beautiful. Still, beauty comes at a cost. With fire came hunger, ambition, jealousy. Mortals began to argue over land, over love, over legacy. What once was shared became divided. Some began to hoard grain, others forged weapons. Walls were built, borders drawn, and soon humans discovered something gods rarely knew: death. It came quietly at first, an accident, a fall, a wound that wouldn't heal. The gods had not planned for this, not truly. Immortality was their birthright. They could not fathom the final breath. But humans, they could, and they did. Zeus watched the first funeral from the clouds. A woman cradling her son beneath the olive tree he had planted. Her tears watered the soil. Her song, though cracked with grief, rose like incense. It reached Olympus. It reached Zeus. And it did not vanish. It stayed. In the chambers of the gods, the matter was discussed. Hera paced, arms folded. "They were given too much," she said. "They break like reeds and blame the wind." Hades, somber as stone, nodded. "Their souls come to me now, wandering, asking, pleading." Athena's brow furrowed. "They do not fear gods as they once did. Now, they fear each other." Poseidon slammed his trident once against the marble floor, then let them return the flame. But Zeus said nothing. He walked alone to the edge of Olympus, where the sky meets the world. Below, he saw a boy tending to a sick lamb, wrapping its legs with cloth and whispering to it, as if his voice alone could heal. He saw an old man sitting beneath a fig tree, carving a flute for a child not yet born. He saw a woman planting seeds even as clouds threatened rain, and he whispered, "They are learning." Mortals were not weak because they died. They were strong because they knew they would, and chose to live anyway. Still, the world needed balance. Zeus summoned the winds. He descended in secret, no thunder, no display, just a quiet moment in the fading light of day. The villagers did not see him, but their dogs stilled. The trees leaned inward, and Zeus reached down. From the soil, he shaped something new, not of flame, but of silence. Not a punishment, but a reminder. He created time, not the eternal loops of Olympus, but time that moved forward, measured, precious. From that moment, humans would grow. They would age, they would love, they would let go, and their lives would become sacred not because they lasted, but because they didn't. Back on Olympus, the gods did not all agree, but they watched. They watched as humans began to honor their dead with stone markers and whispered prayers. They watched as stories of love lost were passed from grandmother to grandchild. They watched as the fear of endings birthed art, music, meaning. They watched and were moved. Even Hades, the keeper of shadows, softened. In his underworld, he built gardens, chambers of memory, rivers for souls to sail. And somewhere, on a cliff beyond the edges of the world, Prometheus hung still, wounded, waiting. But when the eagle flew away each evening and the stars began to rise, he turned his eyes toward earth, and he smiled. The fire had not destroyed them. It had begun them. Zeus, standing beneath the stars, finally spoke, not to the other gods, but to the wind. Let them be. Let them fail. Let them find us, or not. They are no longer children of clay. They are children of choice. And in the hush that followed, the mountain exhaled. Olympus did not fall. It listened. There comes a moment in every life, mortal or divine, when silence speaks louder than sound. For the gods of Olympus, that moment came not with thunder or flame, but with something far softer. A song. One night, as silver mist curled through the hills and the stars blinked slowly overhead, a single voice rose from the earth. It came not from a palace or city, but from a humble hilltop where a boy sat alone, singing to the wind. His words were simple, a lullaby, a thank you, not to any god in particular, just to the sky, to the sea, to the soil, to the feeling that maybe, just maybe, someone was listening, and someone was. Zeus sat motionless in the high clouds, watching the boy's voice drift upward like smoke. It didn't demand. It didn't beg. It offered. Gratitude. That was the first prayer, and it changed everything. The gods, once distant, began to lean closer. Not in pride, but in wonder. Poseidon felt waves shift when fishermen hummed to him at dawn. Demeter wept when farmers left wheat at her altar. Hera watched over young couples as they whispered vows beside riverbeds. Even Hades felt the stir when mourners lit candles and spoke the names of the dead with trembling reverence. And Zeus, he listened. Day by day the prayers grew, not louder, but deeper. They came not just in words, but in deeds. A sculptor carving a statue to honor Athena, a potter marking jars with Hermes' winged sigil for safe travels, a mother naming her child after Artemis beneath the full moon. They built no shrines at first, no temples, only places, a circle of stones, a tree wrapped in ribbon, a stream where coins were left, shining like fallen stars. But soon, stone did rise. Humans, with bare hands and burning hearts, began to build places not just to live, but to remember. They carved temples into cliffs, balanced columns in impossible harmony. They painted the ceilings to mirror the sky and placed fires at the center, eternal, glowing, faithful. The gods watched in awe. They had made humans to reflect divine spark, but now they reflected something else. Love. Not the love of worship, but the love of connection. The temples were not just offerings, they were invitations. So the gods came closer. Some visited in dreams, others in disguise. An old man at a well, a woman by the market gate, a child asking strange questions in the middle of a thunderstorm. And every time a mortal opened their door, their heart, their ears, something sacred happened. The veil between divine and human thinned, not in grand gestures, but in quiet knowing. In the way firelight danced differently when one whispered a name, in how the olive trees seemed to bow a little when someone passed carrying hope. But not all prayers were bright. In the shadows, other voices began to rise, voices of hunger, of loss, of rage. Why do the gods not always answer? They asked. Why must we suffer? Zeus heard those too. He did not flinch. Instead, he sat longer in the skies, listening not just to the joy, but to the ache, to the prayers uttered into empty fields, to to the hands raised in silence when no rain came. He felt it all, and it humbled him. One day, he wandered the earth again, this time as a weathered traveler, cloak heavy with dust. He visited a city where temples stood tall and offerings lay thick. People bowed low, faces hidden, words rehearsed. But no one looked up. No one met his eyes. Then, outside the city, beneath a crooked olive tree, he found a girl sitting alone. She had no statue, no altar, just a worn piece of bread and a chipped cup of water. She placed both on the ground and whispered, "I don't know your name, but I hope you're not lonely." She closed her eyes and smiled. Zeus felt something in his chest that no thunder had ever touched. He knelt beside her, not as a god, but as a soul, and breathed in the air she had just exhaled. The sacred was not in the temple's height. It was in this, the honesty, the reaching, the raw, unpolished dream that someone, somewhere, was listening. When he returned to Olympus, he said nothing for a long time. Then he gathered the gods and said, "We made them to reflect us, but now we must begin to reflect them." From that day on, Olympus changed. It listened more, intervened less, not because the gods stopped caring, but because they began to trust. Humans were not children anymore. They were partners. They were poets and farmers, warriors and healers, mothers and wanderers. They were flame bearers, dream makers, bridge walkers. They rose, they failed, they prayed, they forgot, and still, they loved. Each god began to choose a people, a place, a story to walk beside, not to be worshipped, but to walk with. And in that walking, a new age began. Not the age of titans, not even the age of gods, but the age of wonder. Time does not shout, it whispers. It drifts quietly through the edges of stories, softening corners, blurring names, brushing dust across sacred stones. And slowly, always slowly, it begins to erase. So it was with the gods. They were not abandoned, not suddenly. There were no uprisings, no revolts, only the turning of seasons, the shifting of need, and the quiet drift of human hearts toward new ideas, new empires, new stars to chase. It began with fewer offerings, then fewer songs, then silence. The temples, once alive with laughter and flame, stood cold. Winds swept through their halls like forgotten lullabies. Moss crept over marble feet. Statues cracked, not from violence but from stillness. And on Olympus, the gods felt it. Hestia's hearth dimmed. Poseidon's tides slowed. Demeter's fields no longer bloomed with the same abundance. Even Apollo's lyre sat untouched beneath the golden archway of dawn. Zeus, once greeted with thunderous prayers, now listened to a quieter world. At first, he waited. Surely they would return. Surely they would remember. But the stars blinked indifferently. The earth spun forward, and no one called his name. He wandered the clouds alone, no chariot, no lightning, just a quiet step across a sky that no longer bowed before him. Below, he saw humans growing in ways he hadn't imagined. They mapped the heavens with glass and metal. They crossed oceans, built towers, wrote books that held no gods within their pages. But they loved still. They still held each other at dusk, still sang over newborns and wept for their dead. They still reached for something higher, though now it had no face. And that is what pierced Zeus's heart most deeply. It wasn't anger, it was mourning. One evening, he stood at the edge of the world, where the stars seemed to hang closer than anywhere else. The sky was ink dark, brushed with light. The sea below shimmered with memories. He closed his eyes and listened. A breeze whispered past, A bird cried in the distance. Somewhere, far below, a child laughed in her sleep. Then, a sound, soft where familiar, a prayer, barely audible, like a breath against a window pane. But it was there, real, fragile, a voice not from a temple, but from a rooftop in a crowded city. A young girl, no older than 10, stared up at the stars and whispered, "Dear sky, I don't know who you are, but thank you." Zeus opened his eyes. The stars above did not change, but something in his chest did. He returned to Olympus, not with thunder, but with intention. The gods gathered, some listless, some resigned. Athena sat with a scroll on her lap, unrolled but unread. Hephaestus's forge had gone cold. Artemis stared into the void with a hunter's loneliness. "They don't need us," Hera said quietly. Zeus shook his head. "No," he replied, "not as they did. But perhaps that's not the end." The gods looked at him, and he continued. "They still feel wonder. They still ask questions in the dark. They still dream, and every dream is a doorway." Hades spoke, voice low. "Then we are no longer kings. We are echoes." "Not echoes," Zeus said. "Seeds." That night, a decision was made, not to reclaim, but to release. The gods would step back, not out of bitterness, but out of love. Not to vanish, but to transform. No longer sitting on thrones waiting to be worshipped. They would walk among dreams, symbols, stories. They would hide in poems, flicker through paintings, live in the moments between heartbeat and breath. They would become archetype, metaphor, mystery. They would become myth. And in that myth, they would be remembered, not always by name, but by presence, by the sudden strength before a leap, the voice of courage in a mother's cry, the silence before a storm. And so, they let go. One by one, the gods released their temples, their titles, their need. Poseidon poured his trident into the sea, where it dissolved like salt. Aphrodite gave her mirror to the moon. Hermes let the wind carry away his sandals. Even Hera, proud and poised, set down her crown upon the highest cloud and watched it drift. Zeus was the last. He stood alone at the peak of Olympus, where the world once began. He looked out, not at nations or armies, but at lanterns flickering in the dark, at rooftops glowing with hearthlight, at human hearts still full of questions. And he whispered, "Find us in the quiet. Find us in yourselves." Then, with a breath deeper than sky itself, he released the last bolt of lightning, not in anger, but in blessing. It did not strike. It bloomed. It became a star. And that star still shines. You may have seen it once, without knowing. You may have made a wish upon it. You may have stood beneath it, arms wrapped around someone you love, and felt, if only for a moment, that something greater was holding you. That was him. That was all of them. Not gone. Not forgotten. Just listening. The world had changed. Temples faded into vine-wrapped ruins. Statues eroded until their faces blurred into stone. The names of gods became lessons in classrooms or stories for fireside whispers. People still pointed to the stars, but now they spoke of galaxies, not thrones. Olympus, once blazing with divine presence, now stood quiet above the clouds, no longer abandoned, but resting. And Zeus, he walked the earth one last time, not as the Sky Father, not as the King of Thunder, but as an old traveler, wrapped in a worn cloak, with eyes the color of morning storms and footsteps soft enough not to startle deer. He moved through villages no longer built in his name, and yet, everywhere he went, he saw echoes, in the laughter of children chasing wind, in the way firelight flickered across the eyes of those telling stories, in the way someone held a door open for a stranger just because it felt right. He came to a town carved from white stone and golden dust, where rooftops caught the last light of day like little cups raised to heaven. No one knew him, but somehow no one feared him either. He watched a baker break bread and hand it to a crying boy without asking why. He watched a girl kneel to replant a flower someone had stepped on. He watched an old man pause mid-argument, then laugh instead of shout. And he thought, perhaps the fire never left. Perhaps it changed form. That evening, as the sky deepened into dusk, Zeus climbed a hill just outside the town. The stars had begun to bloom again, quietly watching as they always had. Below him, the homes glowed with soft candlelight. No temple stood, no altar burned. But it was enough. He sat beneath a twisted olive tree whose roots curled like memory into the soil. And there, a boy approached, barefoot, wide-eyed, holding a handmade lantern. "Mister," the boy asked gently, "are you lost?" Zeus smiled. "Number just remembering." The boy sat beside him, knees drawn to his chest. "You talk like the elders, but you don't look like them. Do they tell stories?" Zeus asked. The boy nodded. "Lots. Mostly about the old gods. My favorite's the one with the thunder and the Sky King." Zeus chuckled softly. "He sounds proud." "He was," the boy said, "but kind. They say he left when people stopped calling his name." "And do you believe that?" Zeus asked. The boy looked down. "Sometimes." Zeus tilted his head. "And other times?" The boy hesitated. Then, "Other times, I think he never really left. Just changed. Maybe he's a tree now, or the sound the wind makes right before it rains. Or maybe," he said, glancing sideways with a sheepish grin, "he's a tired old man watching stars with a kid." Zeus's eyes glimmered. "You may be wiser than the elders." The boy shrugged. "They say names are how we remember, but I think stories are how we feel." Zeus nodded slowly, as if that truth had waited eons to be spoken aloud. The stars pulsed above. One shimmered brighter than the rest, a pale blue spark, not part of any constellation. The boy pointed. "That one's my favorite." "Why?" Zeus asked. "Because it's alone, but not lonely." Zeus looked up, then down, then closed his eyes. He could feel Olympus within him still, not as a throne, but as a memory. He could feel Prometheus's fire, not in his palm, but in the boy's lantern. He could feel the prayers of long ago, not as chants, but as quiet acts of kindness that needed no reward. And he knew he was not leaving. He was returning to earth, to myth, to the rhythm of breath, story, and silence. Zeus stood slowly, the weight of countless centuries in his shoulders, and turned to the boy. "Keep the light close," he said. "Not for me, for yourself." The boy looked puzzled. "Are you going somewhere?" Zeus smiled. "Only everywhere." He reached down and touched the top of the boy's head, not as a god blessing a mortal, but as a spark passing into a new flame. Then he walked into the night, and with each step he became less form, less name, less thunder, until there was only wind, only stars, only story. The boy sat long after, staring at the blue star above. He didn't know why, but he felt safer, as if someone ancient had handed him a key, not to a temple, but to a way of seeing the world. Later, he would tell others about the old man with cloud-colored eyes and the voice like summer rain. Some would laugh, others would wonder, and a few, a very few, would look up at the stars and whisper, "I remember." And so, the God who once held the sky in his hands chose instead to hold space in your heart, not as a name carved in stone, but as a whisper in the wind, a flicker in the fire, a moment of wonder that still finds you. When the world grows quiet, Zeus may not sit on a throne anymore, but maybe that's never where he truly belonged. Maybe the gods were never meant to rule us, only to remind us that divinity was never far away, just waiting to be remembered. Thank you for walking with us through this dreamy myth. If the story touched your heart, leave a like, a comment, or simply a quiet breath before you sleep. And remember, sometimes a myth doesn't end, it becomes you.